The blood was already soaking into the dry canyon earth before the cowboy even laid eyes on her. It wasn't hers. That was the first thing he noticed. The second was the laughter. It was the kind of laughter that wasn't born of joy, but of cruelty, bouncing off the rock walls like something broken. She was surrounded. A circle of rough men with greed in their eyes and ropes in their hands. She couldn't have been more than 18, all sharp angles and simmering fire, her body lean like a starved wolf. Her eyes, though. Her eyes held a storm, the kind you see in a wild thing that's been cornered one too many times. They called her cursed, untamable, a prize to be broken. She stood dead center in their circle, hair like black smoke whipped by a wind only she could feel. In her hand, she clutched a jagged piece of rock, its edge dark with that fresh blood. She held it like it was the only thing holding her up, a weapon she believed could crack the world in two. He should have kept riding. That was the smart play. At 32, Silas had buried enough of his own ghosts to know not to go digging up anyone else's. He'd learned the hard way that some fights cost more than you could ever hope to gain. But when his gaze fell on her, standing unbroken in the closing circle, something deep in his chest gave a hard, painful lurch. It was an old ache, a familiar one. Before his mind could talk his heart out of it, his hand was moving on its own. The Colt revolver felt like an extension of his will as it cleared the leather. The shot was a single deafening crack that shattered the canyon's cruel laughter. The men scattered like rats from a burning barn. They threw curses over their shoulders, spat venom into the dust. But the fear of a bullet moved them faster than their greed ever could. The dust settled, leaving a silence that felt louder and hotter than the gunshot. She didn't run to him. She didn't offer a word of thanks. She just stood there, rooted to the spot, her chest rising and falling in shallow, sharp breaths. Her eyes narrowed, pinning him in place, sizing him up as just another kind of threat, a new piece in the same old game. He felt her stare like a physical weight, like an arrow finding the thinnest part of his armor. Then she did something that told him everything he needed to know. She spat on the ground between them, a single, defiant act. It said, "You saved my skin, but you haven't touched my soul." He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat, dry and useless. She turned her back on him, a final cutting dismissal, and walked away into the unforgiving glare of the desert, her posture as straight and proud as if the last 10 minutes had never happened. That night, the flames of his campfire threw dancing shadows that all seemed to take her shape. He couldn't close his eyes without seeing hers, burning with a fire that had no business being in someone so young. They weren't the eyes of a girl. They were the eyes of a survivor, of someone who had stared into the abyss and hadn't blinked. And his memory, that traitorous thing, chose that moment to drag up an image he spent every day trying to forget. His sister, Lily. Laughter like a cool river, hair the color of corn silk. Gone. Taken in a night of fire and screams when raiders torched their ranch years ago. He'd been just a boy. Too young, too scared, too slow. The Apache girl's defiance was a ghost at his shoulder, whispering his failures back to him. He swore into the fire, a low, bitter curse. He would not carry the fate of another lost soul. This world was already too full of graves. But even as he formed the words, he knew he was lying. His heart had already made a choice his mind refused to accept, and that choice would lead them both into a darkness he couldn't possibly imagine. By dawn, he found her. Not because he was looking, he told himself, but because fate in this part of the country had a twisted sense of humor. She was walking the dusty track toward the town of Redemption, a place that had long forgotten the meaning of its own name. She was barefoot, her shoulders squared like a soldier marching toward her own execution. As she passed, mothers snatched their children indoors. Men watched her from the shadows of storefronts, their eyes narrowed with suspicion and scorn. The preacher's wife, a woman whose piety was as thin as her lips, muttered that the girl was a plague sent by the devil himself. She walked through their hatred like it was a mild breeze, never flinching. But Silas saw it. He saw the way her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her nails biting into her palms, drawing tiny beads of blood. She was a ghost in broad daylight, a specter of their own bad conscience. No door opened for her. No one offered a cup of water. She moved through redemption completely and utterly alone. He followed at a distance, a shadow tracking a shadow, telling himself it was just to make sure she came to no harm. But he knew, deep down, it was more than that. He was tied to her now, by a thread he couldn't see but could feel pulling him forward. The second time he intervened, it was quieter. He bought a loaf of bread and left it on a flat rock near the creek where she had stopped to rest. He didn't wait for her to see him. He just left it and walked away. When he circled back hours later, as dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, the bread was gone. But the tin plate he'd left it on was sitting on the rock, wiped clean, placed neatly. It was a silent conversation, an acknowledgement without surrender. And that's how it began. The days that followed were a quiet, unspoken truce. He'd leave food. A few hours later, the plate would be returned. He left a wool blanket one evening when the temperature dropped. The next morning, he found it folded with military precision on the branch of a mesquite tree. There were no smiles, no words, no softening in her gaze. Yet the invisible thread between them tightened, frail as a spider's web, but growing stronger than steel. Still, the voice of reason, the voice of survival, screamed at him to run, to get on his horse and ride until her face was just another faded memory. She was nothing to him, just a stray, a magnet for trouble he didn't need. This time, he was serious. He saddled his horse before the sun was even a rumor in the east. He rode north hard and fast, forcing himself not to look back. 1 day, 2 days. He put miles between them, the dust of the trail a welcome curtain. He was free. He had done his part. He repeated it like a mantra, trying to drown out the insistent pull in his gut. On the 3rd day, the lie fell apart. He saw her, or what was left of her. She was collapsed at the edge of a shallow river, half in and half out of the water, her skin flushed with a terrifying heat he could feel from 10 feet away. Fever. It was burning her alive. The sight of her, so fragile and helpless after being so fierce, hit him harder than any bullet ever had. The war inside him ended in that instant. Without a second thought, he was off his horse, lifting her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of rags and fire. Her body burned against his chest as he carried her toward the skeletal remains of an old abandoned barn. He told himself he would only stay until the fever broke, just until she was on her feet. Then he would be gone for good. It was the 3rd promise he'd made to himself about her, and it was the 3rd one he was about to break. Inside the crumbling barn, motes of dust danced in the slivers of light cutting through the warped boards. He laid her on a pile of dry, musty straw, her breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. The fever was a thief, stealing her strength, her defiance, leaving only a fragile shell. When she cried out, the words were in her own tongue, a language as ancient and wild as the land itself. She twisted in the straw, lost in a world of pain and shadow. He sat beside her, took her small burning hand in his, and held on tight, as if he could anchor her to the world of the living through sheer force of will. He didn't know what else to do. That night, the sky broke open, not with rain, but with a dry, angry thunder that rattled the old barn to its foundations. Lightning split the heavens, and in those brief, brilliant flashes, he saw the battle etched on her face. He spent every hour of that long night by her side, wiping the sweat from her brow with his own sleeve, murmuring useless words of comfort that were more for him than for her. He was a sentinel, guarding a flickering flame against a hurricane. When the first pale light of dawn finally crept through the cracks, it brought with it the sound of men's voices and the cruel, familiar cadence of their laughter. He knew who they were before he even saw them. The same men from the canyon. Their boots crunched on the gravel outside, heavy with menace. They hadn't given up. They still wanted their prize. And now, they wanted revenge on the man who had dared to stand in their way. Silas rose slowly, his body stiff from the long vigil. His revolver felt cool and solid in his hand, a stark contrast to the fire pumping through his veins. Behind him, she stirred on the straw, her eyes fluttering open just enough to see his silhouette framed against the barn door, a lone barrier against the coming violence. "Fool," one of the men spat from outside. "You think you can protect that savage? She belongs to us." The world seemed to hold its breath. The air grew thick, heavy as oil. Then the silence shattered as the first man charged the door. Gunfire erupted, a roaring beast unleashed in the quiet morning. The barn filled with smoke and the metallic smell of blood. Dust kicked up from the floor, obscuring everything in a chaotic haze. Silas fought not with desperation, but with a cold, terrifying clarity. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man with a vow he hadn't spoken but had sealed the moment he lifted her from that riverbank. When the last echo of gunfire faded, a profound stillness settled over the land. The ground outside the barn was littered with the cost of their hatred. Silas stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, a hot line of pain searing across his arm where a bullet had grazed him. His revolver trembled in his hand, not from fear, but from the sheer force of what he had just done. He turned, his gaze finding hers in the dusty gloom. Her eyes, once so cold, so wary, held something new. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't surrender, it was recognition. As if, through the smoke and violence, she had finally seen him, not as a savior, not as an enemy, but as a shield. Someone willing to stand beside her, to bleed with her. A ragged breath escaped her lips, but her gaze never wavered, and in that moment, as the sun climbed over the horizon, Silas felt the very axis of his world shift. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that nothing would ever be the same again. This was just the beginning. The sun rose higher, casting a harsh light on the grim work that followed. With hands that were calloused and steady, Silas buried them. The men who had come to inflict so much pain were now just part of the silent, unforgiving earth. Sweat and blood mingled at his temple as he worked, the rhythmic scrape of the shovel the only sound in the canyon. From the doorway of the barn, she watched him. Her thin frame was no longer slumped in fever but stood straight, her posture regaining its warrior's edge. Her eyes, clear now, seemed to hold a wisdom that far surpassed her 18 years. When he finally finished and walked back toward the barn, exhausted and bleeding, she met him halfway. Without a word, without the slightest hesitation, she reached for his injured arm. She tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her own worn dress and began to bind the wound. Her touch was gentle, her fingers sure and steady. They lingered for a moment longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of the debt of blood that now flowed between them. It was the first time she had touched him without defiance, without a wall of ice between them. In that small, quiet gesture, a fragile spark ignited in the space they shared. It was something new, something unnamed, but it felt as unyielding as the rock beneath their feet. They left the barn and the fresh graves behind them, two solitary figures moving across a vast, indifferent landscape. They were shadows on the run, the whispers of what happened chasing them like a bad wind. But in the midst of the danger, they found a strange new rhythm. They became a unit of two against the world. At dusk, he would build a small, contained fire, its warmth a temporary shield against the encroaching darkness. and she would sing. Her voice was low, her songs in a language older than the dusty towns they skirted. The melodies drifted through the night air, threads of sound that were part haunting and part prayer. He didn't understand a single word, but he understood the deep well of longing they came from. It was the same ache he felt in his own chest when he stared up at the endless blanket of stars. By day, she walked beside his horse, her pace steady, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, as alert and aware as any scout he'd ever known. At a remote trading post, he spent the last of his silver coins on a shawl the color of a sunset. He pressed it into her hands, a clumsy offering. She took it, and when she draped it over her shoulders, the vibrant red was a sudden, startling flame against the muted browns of the desert. In that moment, he saw that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to live again. But the world had a long memory and a merciless heart. The whispers followed them everywhere. In one grimy town, the men at the saloon muttered that Silas had betrayed his own kind, that he was a traitor to his blood. They were forced to leave in the dead of night, the threat of a rope hanging in the air. Later, in the high country, they encountered an Apache scout. He looked at Silas with contempt, but he spoke to her in their shared tongue. Silas watched her face, saw her expression remain a stoic mask, but he knew the words were blades. When the scout was gone, she was silent for hours. That night, by the fire, he saw her shoulders trembling, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. Finally, she looked at him, her eyes sharp and piercing in the firelight. "Why?" she asked, her voice ragged, the single word heavy with the weight of everything they had endured. "Why do you keep me?" He looked into her eyes, and for the first time in 10 years, he spoke the truth that he had kept locked away. He told her about Lily, about the fire, the screams, and the guilt that had been his only companion for a decade. "I lost a sister once," he said, his voice cracking in the quiet night. "I won't stand by and lose another." The silence that followed was absolute. She didn't offer words of comfort. She didn't have to. She simply reached out and pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over his hammering heart. A simple touch that calmed the storm inside him. And in that moment, their bond was forged into something far stronger than survival. It was the beginning of family. But peace, they were learning, was a luxury this land did not afford. Word of them, the white man and the Apache girl, traveled on the wind, a story twisted and embellished by tongues eager for violence. A new threat emerged, a gang of bounty hunters led by a man who hated everything she was and everything Silas had come to represent. They rode hard, and they rode fast, their intentions as clear as the guns on their hips. Silas and the girl, whose name he now knew was Annaba, were cornered in a deep, winding canyon, the red rock walls a cage with no exit. Dust rose from the canyon floor, stirred by the wind, looking like the ghosts of 100 other battles fought on this same ground. This time, there was no running. Annaba stood beside him, a short, powerful bow in her hand that seemed a natural extension of her arm. Her eyes blazed with the fire of her ancestors. Silas cocked his revolver, the sound echoing in the sudden, tense silence. His heart beat a steady, clear rhythm. He was no longer a man adrift. He knew exactly what he was fighting for. The clash, when it came, was a maelstrom of chaos and violence. Bullets whined and ricocheted off the canyon walls. Arrows hissed through the air, silent and deadly. Dust and gunpowder choked the air as horses screamed and men fell. Annaba moved with a lethal grace, a phantom warrior born of this harsh land. She was untamable, yes, but she was also fiercely loyal. Every arrow she loosed found its mark with unerring precision. Silas fought with the grim efficiency of a man who had seen too much death. He was a rock, an anchor in the swirling tide of the fight. Together they were a force of nature. When the last man fell, the canyon seemed to exhale, the sudden silence as shocking as the noise had been. The bitter smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. They were bruised, bleeding, and exhausted, but they were standing. He turned to her, his arm throbbing where a bullet had torn through the muscle. His eyes met hers, and for the first time since Lily's death, the hollow emptiness inside him was gone. She wasn't a memory. She wasn't a burden. She was his equal, his anchor, his flame. She had fought not as a damsel in distress, not as someone who needed saving, but as a warrior who had chosen to make her stand beside him. The truth hit him with the force of a revelation, as clear and bright as the sun breaking over the plains. He hadn't just rescued a girl in a canyon. He had found the one thing he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to live. She was the home his wandering soul had been searching for all along. The real trouble began when he asked her about the small leather pouch she always wore around her neck. They were a few days out from the canyon battle, his arm healing, their strange peace settling back into place. He'd noticed it before, but after the fight, after seeing what she was capable of, his curiosity got the better of him. "What is it you carry?" he asked gently, pointing to the pouch. Her reaction was instantaneous. The warmth that had been growing between them vanished, replaced by the old, familiar ice. Her hand flew to her neck, covering the pouch protectively. Her eyes narrowed. "It is nothing," she said, her voice flat and final. But Silas knew she was lying. He had seen the way the last bounty hunter had looked at it, right before Anaba's arrow had silenced him forever. There was a hunger in that man's eyes, a greed that went beyond a simple bounty. He let it go, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. That night, as she slept, she cried out, not in Apache, but in a single clear word of English, a name. "Lily." Silas froze, the blood turning to ice in his veins. It was impossible. He had never spoken his sister's name aloud to her. He had only said, "my sister." How could she know? The air in the camp grew cold, the friendly fire suddenly feeling menacing. He watched her sleep, her face troubled, and the questions hammered at him. Who was this girl, really? What secrets was she hiding in that leather pouch? The next morning, the tension between them was a thick, suffocating blanket. He was watching her now, not as a protector, but as a man looking for answers. She could feel his suspicion, and it drove a wedge between them, pushing them back into their solitary corners. They traveled in a strained silence for 2 more days. On the 3rd day, they stumbled upon the burned-out shell of a small homestead. It looked like it had been hit by raiders. A family, gone. The sight of it brought all of his own demons roaring back to the surface. As he stood there, staring at the charred timber, Anaba walked up behind him. "It was them," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The ones who took me." The story came out in a torrent, as if a dam had finally broken inside her. She hadn't been born Apache. She was like him, a survivor of a raid. She had been taken as a small child from a homestead, just like this one. The raiders who took her had been a mixed group of outlaws and tribe outcasts. They were brutal, but one of the older women had taken pity on her, raising her as her own. She had lived in a strange twilight world, never truly belonging to the people who had stolen her and completely cut off from the world she had lost. And then came the twist that stopped his heart. "There was another girl," Anaba said, her eyes fixed on the ruins. "She was older. She had hair like the sun. She was sick from the smoke. She didn't last long." Anaba paused, her breath catching in her throat. "Before she died, she gave me something. She made me promise to keep it safe. She said it would protect me." She reached into the pouch around her neck and pulled out her hand. Lying on her palm was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. His wooden bird. The one he had carved for Lily the morning of the raid. The world tilted on its axis. He staggered back, his mind reeling. This girl, this wild, defiant girl he had saved. was the last person on Earth to see his sister alive. The revelation was a gut punch that left him breathless. Every look, every touch, every shared silence was suddenly recast in a new, shattering light. He hadn't just saved a stranger. He had found the last living link to his sister, a ghost from his past walking in the flesh. Anaba watched him, her expression unreadable, as he struggled to process the impossible truth. He finally found his voice, a ragged whisper. "What else? What else is in the pouch?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the leather pouch still clutched in her hand. Slowly, she untied it and tipped its contents onto a flat rock. It wasn't a charm or a keepsake. It was a piece of tanned hide, folded into a small square. When she unrolled it, Silas saw the intricate lines and strange symbols tattooed onto its surface. It was a map. The man who led the raiders, Anaba explained, her voice low. He was a white man. He was looking for something, silver, an old Spanish mine lost in the mountains. He tortured the location from an old prospector before he killed him. He tattooed the map on this hide. After he died in a tribal dispute, the woman who raised me kept it hidden. And just like that, everything clicked into place. The men in the canyon, the bounty hunters. They weren't after her. They were after the map. Her reputation as a cursed girl was a lie, a story deliberately spread to isolate her, to make her an easy target for anyone who knew the secret she carried. Her own adoptive people had cast her out not because they hated her, but to protect themselves from the violent men the map would inevitably attract. They are all connected, Silas realized, the pieces falling together with sickening clarity. There's someone bigger behind this, someone with money and power, pulling the strings. He looked at the map, then at Anaba. The haunted girl he had pitied was gone. In her place was the keeper of a dangerous secret, the key to a fortune that men would kill for, and he was standing right next to her. They were no longer just two outcasts against the world. They were the keepers of a treasure and the targets of every greedy killer in the territory. Their journey had just taken another violent, deadly turn. They were no longer just running from the past. They were being hunted by it. Now, their every move was calculated. They were no longer just travelers. They were fugitives. The name that kept cropping up in hushed conversations at lonely trading posts was Corcoran, a wealthy land baron from the east, a man who bought up land, people, and loyalties with equal ruthlessness. He was the invisible puppet master, the one who had been funding the hunt for the map for years. His network was vast, his hired guns relentless. They were no longer fighting random gangs of thugs, they were fighting an army. The open plains became a death trap. They took to the high country, the treacherous, rocky terrain their only ally. Here, their roles reversed. Silas, the seasoned cowboy, was a novice in this vertical world. Anaba, however, was in her element. She moved through the rocks with the silent grace of a mountain cat, her knowledge of tracking, of living off the harsh land, keeping them alive. She taught him which plants were safe to eat, how to find water where there seemed to be none, how to read the signs of the land. He, in turn, taught her how to handle the Colt, how to reload it quickly, how to stand her ground. They were no longer a protector and his charge. They were partners, their skills a perfect complement to one another. One night, huddled behind a rock outcropping as a blizzard raged around them, the cold seeping into their bones, she finally asked the question he had been dreading. "Tell me about her. Tell me about Lily." And so he did. He poured out the stories he had kept locked inside for a decade, painting a picture of his sister not as a tragic victim, but as the vibrant, laughing girl she had been. He spoke of her kindness, her stubborn streak, her dream of seeing the ocean. As he spoke, he felt the icy grip of his guilt begin to thaw. Anaba listened, her eyes never leaving his face. When he was done, a profound silence filled their small shelter. "She was brave," Anaba said softly. In the end, she was not afraid. Those simple words were a gift, a balm on a wound he thought would never heal. In sharing his grief, he had found a measure of peace. In sharing her last memory of Lily, she had given him back a piece of his sister. Their bond, forged in blood and fire, was now tempered by a shared history, a shared love for a girl they had both lost. It was a bond that Corcoran's men, no matter how many, would find impossible to break. They were finally cornered in a place the locals called Devil's Jaw, a narrow box canyon that was a natural trap. Corcoran's men had driven them there, a dozen riders appearing on the ridge above, blocking the only escape. It was a mirror of that very first day, but this time the world was different. This time Silas was not alone. Anaba knocked an arrow to her bowstring, her movements fluid and calm. Silas checked the loads in his revolver, his hands steady. They stood back to back, a tiny island of defiance against a tide of violence. There is only one way out of this, Silas said, his voice low and grim. Through them. Anaba didn't reply in words. She just gave a slight, sharp nod. The fight that ensued was a masterpiece of desperation and strategy. They used the canyon's natural cover, turning the trap into their fortress. Anaba's arrows flew from the shadows, picking off riders with silent precision. Silas used his limited ammunition judiciously, his shots creating chaos, making their small force seem larger than it was. They fought with a seamless coordination that came not from training, but from a deep, instinctual understanding of one another. But there were too many. For every man that fell, two more seemed to take his place. They were being pushed deeper into the canyon, their cover shrinking, the circle tightening. A bullet ricocheted off the rock near Silas's head, showering him with stone fragments. Anaba's quiver was almost empty. The end seemed inevitable. And then a new figure appeared on the ridge. A lone rider, silhouetted against the setting sun. For a heart-stopping moment, Silas thought it was Corcoran himself, come to watch the final act. But the rider raised a rifle, and the shot that rang out didn't come towards them. It took out one of Corcoran's men who had been creeping up on their flank. It was the Apache scout, the one who had told Anaba she was an outcast. He sat on his horse, his face a mask of stone, and began firing into the ranks of their attackers. His sudden, inexplicable betrayal threw Corcoran's men into confusion. It was the opening they needed. Silas and Anaba launched a ferocious counterattack, pushing forward with the last of their strength. The scout fought like a man possessed, but he was one against many. He went down in a hail of gunfire, his sacrifice buying them precious seconds. They broke through the line, scrambling up the rocky canyon wall as bullets whined around them. They reached the top, breathless and bleeding, leaving the chaos behind. Their horses were gone, their supplies lost. They were stranded in the wilderness, with more of Corcoran's men undoubtedly on their way. Silas looked at Anaba, then pulled the map from his jacket. His finger traced the lines to a single point, marked with a star. "He won't stop until he has this," Silas said. "We can't keep running. There's only one place to end this." Anaba looked at the map, her eyes hard. "To the mine," she said. It was no longer a flight for survival. It was a race to a final confrontation. The journey to the lost mine was a pilgrimage into the heart of the wilderness and into the depths of their own pasts. The map was their guide, but the land itself was a relentless adversary. They crossed sun-scorched plains that shimmered with heat mirages, their water growing dangerously low. They climbed through jagged mountain passes where the wind howled like a hungry wolf, the cold a physical enemy. Every step was a battle, every sunrise a small victory. During the long, grueling days, they fell into a comfortable silence, two people moving as one. But at night, huddled by the warmth of a tiny, smokeless fire, they talked. He told her about the ranch, about the dreams his father had for the land, dreams that had turned to ash. He spoke of the emptiness that had followed him for years, a shadow he could never outrun. She, in turn, told him more about her life with the tribe. It wasn't the simple story of a captive. She spoke of the woman who raised her, a woman who had shown her kindness in a world of cruelty. She described the sting of being an outsider, of carrying a face that was a constant reminder of a world they despised, of having a foot in two canoes and a home in neither. They were mapping the barren landscapes of each other's souls, finding a strange and beautiful symmetry in their shared scars. They found the mine tucked away in a hidden valley, a place so remote and inaccessible it felt like a secret the earth had tried to keep. The entrance was concealed behind a waterfall that cascaded down a sheer rock face, the water a shimmering curtain. The Apache had considered the valley sacred, a place of spirits. It was clear why they had been so desperate to keep it hidden. Pushing through the waterfall was like stepping into another world. The air inside the mine was cold and still, heavy with the smell of damp earth and forgotten time. Using a makeshift torch, they ventured into the darkness. The silver was there, thick veins of it glittering in the torchlight like frozen lightning. It was a king's ransom, enough to make any man mad with greed. But as they went deeper, they found something else. The mine was a tomb. They found the skeletons of prospectors, the tattered remains of their clothing still clinging to bone, skulls fractured by violence. This wasn't just a mine, it was Corcoran's graveyard, a place where he buried his secrets along with his victims. The sheer, calculated evil of the man was a palpable presence in the suffocating dark. They knew they couldn't stay. They would take nothing. This place, and the silver it held, was cursed by blood. As they turned to leave, to step back through the watery curtain into the sunlight, a figure blocked their path. It was the Apache scout. Or rather, his ghost. No, not a ghost. Silas blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. It was another scout, dressed almost identically, his face grim. He tracked you, Silas realized aloud. The first one. His death was a message. To his brother. The scout nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and fury. He held a bow with an arrow nocked, pointed directly at Anaba's heart. You led them here, the scout accused in broken English. You have defiled this sacred place with the white man's greed. Before they could respond, another voice, smooth and cold as a serpent, echoed from behind the scout. Oh, she had help. A man stepped out from the shadows of the mine entrance, his clothes expensive, his smile predatory. He was flanked by a half-dozen of the hardest-looking men Silas had ever seen. Corcoran, Silas breathed. Corcoran tipped his hat, his eyes glittering with triumph. Thank you, my dear, he said, his gaze locking onto Anaba, for finally leading me home. The scout who had sacrificed himself hadn't been a traitor. He'd been a decoy, a sacrifice to make them feel safe, to lure them into the final trap. And they had walked right into it. It all comes back to a single night of fire, doesn't it? Corcoran said, his voice echoing in the damp cavern. He walked toward them, casual, confident, the owner of this dark stage. I wasn't after silver that night, not originally. I was after your father's land grant, Silas, the old Spanish title. But your father was a stubborn man. Corcoran's eyes were devoid of any light. Then we found the prospector, and he told us a better story, a story about a mountain full of silver. He was the one, the man in the shadows from that night, the architect of all Silas's pain, the man who had given the order that ended Lily's life. The rage that boiled up in Silas was so pure, so hot, it nearly blinded him. He lunged, but Corcoran's men were faster, the butt of a rifle catching him in the ribs, driving him to his knees. Patience. Corcoran chuckled. All this time I've been searching. All this time the key was a little girl I'd forgotten all about. He looked at Anaba, and the last piece of the puzzle, the last living link to that ranch, walks right back into my story. The poetry of it all. He turned to the Apache scout. Your brother was a fool. I offered him a treaty, protection for his people. All he had to do was deliver the girl. Anaba spoke then, her voice ringing out in the cavern, clear and strong. She spoke in the Apache tongue, not to Corcoran, but to the scout. Her words were not a plea. They were a challenge, a reminder of who he was, of the sacred ground he stood on, of the ancestors who were watching. She spoke of honor, and of the shame of siding with a man who would poison the earth for shiny rocks. Silas saw the conflict in the scout's eyes. The man's knuckles were white on his bow. The final bloody act was about to begin, and it began with a choice. The scout, his face a mask of torment, turned his bow, not on Anaba, but on Corcoran. He loosed his arrow just as Corcoran's men opened fire. The arrow buried itself in the shoulder of the man next to Corcoran, but the scout was cut down in a volley of lead, his act of redemption his last. The cavern exploded into a whirlwind of violence. In the confusion, Silas surged to his feet, tackling the man who had struck him, his fists a blur of pent-up fury. Anaba was a whirlwind, a small knife appearing in her hand as she moved through the chaos, a deadly dance in the flickering torchlight. It all came down to Silas and Corcoran. They met in the center of the mine, a desperate, brutal fight for their lives. Corcoran was bigger, stronger, but Silas was fueled by a decade of grief and rage. They crashed against the rock walls, the silver veins a silent, glittering audience to their struggle. Silas finally got the upper hand, his revolver pressed under Corcoran's chin. He had him, the man who had destroyed his world. He could end it, right here. A single pull of the trigger. Anaba was watching him, her face streaked with dirt and blood, her eyes wide. And in that moment, Silas saw two paths. One of vengeance, which would leave him as empty as the man he was about to kill, and one of a future, with her. He made his choice. Near them, left by the prospectors, was a crate of old, unstable dynamite. Keeping his gun on Corcoran, Silas grabbed a stick and lit the fuse from the torch. "You love this mountain so much," Silas rasped, his voice raw. "You can have it." He shoved Corcoran back towards the center of the cavern, threw the lit dynamite deep into a fissure, and grabbed Anaba's hand. "Run!" They scrambled for the entrance, for the curtain of water, for the light. They burst through the waterfall, just as a deep, rumbling groan came from within the mountain. The ground shook violently, and the entrance to the mine collapsed in a deafening roar of falling rock. It was over. Corcoran, his men, and his silver obsession were buried forever. Silas and Anaba stood there, gasping for air, covered in dust, with the roar of the waterfall the only sound. They had nothing. No horses, no supplies, no map, nothing but each other. And for the first time, it felt like everything. They walked away from the collapsed mine and never looked back. The world they re-entered felt new, washed clean. The constant threat that had shadowed their every step was gone, buried under a mountain of rock. They were no longer fugitives, no longer hunted. They were just two people, a man and a woman, free to choose their own path for the first time. They made their way back to the rolling plains, the land where their story had begun. It looked different now. It was no longer a place of ghosts and painful memories. It was a place of possibility. They found a small, unclaimed parcel of land by a creek, with a view of the mountains that had almost been their tomb. This, they decided, was where they would build. He worked with his hands, felling timber, raising walls, the hard physical labor a welcome penance. She worked alongside him, her strength and resilience a constant, quiet inspiration. They built their small cabin, not as a fortress to hide from the world, but as a home to welcome a future. One evening, as they sat in the doorway of their half-finished home, watching the sunset paint the sky, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden bird. He had retrieved it from the mine before the collapse. He held it out to her. Lily would have wanted you to have it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You kept her memory safe. You carried her home. Annaba took the small bird, her fingers closing around it. And for the first time since he'd met her, Silas saw her cry. Not the wild, angry tears of a cornered animal, but quiet, healing tears of release. She wasn't the cursed Apache girl anymore. And he wasn't the broken cowboy haunted by his past. They were just Silas and Annaba. A few months later, their cabin finished, a small garden taking root. A traveling preacher happened to pass by. He was a kind-faced man, his eyes full of the horizon. He saw the unlikely pair, the white man mending a fence, the Apache woman tending her plants, their movements easy and familiar around each other. He saw not sin, not disgrace, but a profound and hard-won peace. The preacher tipped his hat, offered a silent blessing, and rode on, a small testament to the fact that even in a hard land, grace could find a place to grow. They had found their justice, not in a mountain of silver or in the cold satisfaction of revenge, but in the quiet courage to build a home in a world that had told them they didn't belong. But they belonged to each other. And sometimes, in the end, that's the only thing that truly matters. If you were moved by the story of Silas and Annaba, and you believe that even in the darkest of times, people can find their way home to each other, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that prove the human spirit is the most untamable force of all. We'll see you in the next one.